Hello, and welcome to our first video about descriptive statistics. There are lots of ways to describe data, and today we're just going to really focus on different ways that we can have data look and be represented, and how we can describe it. So one way to describe it is by using univariate descriptors. And a univariate descriptor is just a fancy way of saying data that's talking about one topic or one specific type of thing. One way to describe specifically the center is to use either the mean or the median, depending on what your data looks like. You can also describe the spread or the variability by using either standard deviation or a 5-number summary. And we'll talk about these things in a lot more detail in later videos, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up about them now. So the first thing we're going to talk about is symmetric versus skewed distributions. And we often like to start with the symmetric. Symmetric is a lot of times the easiest type of data to work with. When your data is symmetric, your mean and your median are pretty close to the same number, and you have your data equally distributed on both sides of that mean and median. Now, oftentimes, most often, data doesn't work out that way. So your data can either be skewed left or skewed right, or negative versus positive. When your data is skewed left, your mean is on the left of your median. And when your data is skewed right, your mean is on the right of your median, or it's bigger. That's sometimes hard to remember. A lot of times you can think of it as your data is skewed based on where the tail is. So if your tail is on the left, then your data is skewed left. If your tail is on the right, then your data is skewed right. And sometimes that almost seems backwards. Sometimes we want to describe it by where the lump is, but just kind of keep in mind that that's not how we describe data. It's all based on the tail. Now, when you're deciding which way to best describe your data, if your data is pretty symmetrical and does not have a lot of outliers, then you want to use your mean and standard deviation. If your data is skewed or has really big outliers, a 5-number summary is often better because that's going to tell us a little bit more about where the majority of the data lies. And again, we're going to talk about these two things in a lot more detail in later videos. Now, to find these things, you can find them by hand, but at this point, it's very inefficient to find them by hand. So what you're going to do is you'll take your data and you're going to put it into one of your lists. And then when you hit the Stat button, you would go here to edit your list. And we'll do this together in a minute. And then if you tab over one to the Calculate menu, and you do the one variable statistics option, which is the first option there, it gives you all of the information you need. So when you have a very large set of data, please don't try to calculate the mean and median by hand. It just takes a long time. If you're going to calculate the median, you have to put all the numbers in order and then find the middle number. If you're calculating the mean, you're going to have to add them all up and then divide by the number of numbers you have, or just use your calculator to do it. This is your mean right here, X bar. These are summations and summation squares. We really don't use those very often for our purposes. Here's your standard deviation, and you actually have two options for standard deviation. The first one deals with if you have a sample of a population, and this one is dealing with the whole population. So, like if you were sampling 20 15-year-olds from Lindbergh High School versus if you were sampling every, or if you had every 15-year-old at Lindbergh High School, that would be like a population versus sample. And we'll talk about that more later as well. But then you also have your 5-number summary. You have your minimum, your median, and your maximum. And then your quartiles are in here as well. Remember, your quartiles are just the middle of like your min and your median, or the middle of your max and your median. So here's your 5-number summary. So again, you can find it by hand, but again, at this point, I think it's much more efficient if you just pop them in your calculator. And I did want to show you that sometimes data ends up like this. This is called bimodal. Bimodal data is really exactly how it sounds. It has two kind of, I guess, lumps or sections or whatever you want to think of it. A lot of times when we have data that's bimodal, we just split it in half and we describe it in 2 halves instead of 1. So let's talk about how we can make these histograms in our graphing calculator. So if you want, go ahead and pop it out. We're going to use this data. You might want to pause your video when we get to it and put this in yourself. So first, when you are trying to put a histogram into your graphing calculator, you are going to turn on your stat plot. And a lot of times it's off. It defaults to off. So what you do, you can follow the numbers I have written here. Scroll it up just a little bit. There we go. Is you will hit second and then y equals, and it brings up this. And you have lots of different stat plots. Usually you're just going to turn the first one on. So if you just hit enter, then it brings up this. You want it to be on, and then you can also pick the type. Since you're going for a histogram, you're going to pick this one right here. Then you can exit out of that by doing second quit. Then you want to put your numbers into your list, which is what I was talking about earlier. So you hit your stat button, then you go to edit. And I have already put the data from above in my list. So there are 24 numbers in the data, and you can scroll up and down and all that stuff in my list 1. Once you get all that typed in, exit out of it again. And then you can go to your zoom button, and option 9 here, option 9 right here is zoom stat. And zoom stat will give you a perfect window and make your scale or make your histograms for you. So if we were going to describe this particular histogram, I would say that it's fairly symmetrical except for this piece right here in the middle. So I would probably describe this as, actually, see how we get really small over here? I would say that this would be considered more of a tail. This would be considered your tail over here on the right. So this would be right skewed. Since it's skewed, you would describe it using your 5-number summary, which if you hit your stat button again and you go over to calc and do 1var stats, option 1, depending on the version of your calculator, you might have to answer these questions. Just hit enter. It'll give you all the things you want, and then you can just arrow down to get the min, the first quartile, the median, the third quartile, and then your maximum value. Thanks for listening, and box and whisker plots is up next.